I did not go to Caldenmere expecting to witness a conspiracy. I went because Richard Caldenmere asked me to, and when Richard asks, one goes. He is the sort of man whose requests feel less like invitations and more like natural law, quiet, absolute, and requiring no further justification. We had been friends since university, through his army years and mine, through the death of his wife and the long gray years that followed. And if he wanted company for a fortnight in the country, I was not going to refuse him simply because November at Caldenmere was famous for its cold. What I was not prepared for was the house. I had been to Caldenmere once before, years ago, when his father was still alive, and the estate ran in its old formal way. That visit had been orderly, masculine, and brief. This visit was something else entirely. Richard had taken on, in the years since his father's passing, the informal wardenship of 4 female relations who had nowhere else to go and considerable opinions about everything. His grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Caldenmere, who was 81 and had not softened with age. His Aunt Dorothea and his Aunt Cecily, sisters in both blood and temperament, who had opinions about curtain arrangement and the proper temperature of a sitting room and would share these opinions whether asked or not. And his cousin, Miss Harriet Caldenmere, a vigorous woman of 40 who had decided, some years before, that marriage was not for her, and had channeled the energy she might have spent on a husband into the management of every living thing within a 5-mile radius. These 4 women ran Caldenmere Hall the way a fleet admiral runs a squadron, with comprehensive authority, divided command, and a great deal of overlapping jurisdiction. They were formidable individually. Together, as I was about to discover, they were something that should have had its own military designation. And managing all of them, when I arrived on the 3rd of November, was Mrs. Elspeth Vane. I noticed her within the first 10 minutes, which was not, I suspect, what she intended. She was the kind of woman who was very good at being where she was needed and invisible everywhere else. A widow in her early 30s, neat and composed, with dark eyes that took everything in quietly, and a manner that suggested she had learned, early and well, how to keep calm while several things went wrong at once. She had come to Caldenmere the previous year as a companion to the Dowager, had remained because the Dowager refused to let her go, and had gradually, and without anyone formally assigning it to her, become the quiet center around which the household revolved. She ordered the fires. She mediated the curtain disagreements between the aunts, which were ongoing and occasionally heated. She knew when Aunt Dorothea required chamomile, and when she required silence, and she had developed an unerring instinct for the difference. She ran everything and was thanked for nothing, because the 4 ladies of Caldenmere regarded her management of their lives as simply the natural order of things, the way one regards the rising of the sun. Richard did not notice her at all. This was not unusual. Richard, since his wife's death, had developed a thoroughgoing indifference to the human landscape around him. He was not cruel. He was too disciplined for cruelty. But he had pulled his attention inside himself so completely that the world beyond his immediate business barely registered. I had watched him fail to notice a great many things in the 6 years since Alina died. Friends' promotions, invitations from people who genuinely wished him well, and most recently, a winter supper at which 3 different women had been placed beside him in succession by the Marchioness hosting it, in the evident hope that one of them might interest him. None of them had. He had talked to each of them with the correct degree of politeness, and then talked to me about the estate's drainage problem for the rest of the evening. He was not cold by nature. He had been warm once before Alina, but warmth requires believing one is still a participant in life, and Richard had quietly stepped back from that conviction. Caldenmere, I had thought, country air, perhaps his own grandmother. Something familiar, something that did not require him to perform. I had not factored in Mrs. Vane. On the evening of our 2nd day, the Dowager placed Elspeth at dinner beside Richard. I watched from across the table. It was done with such apparent innocence, a quiet word to the footman, a small adjustment to the arrangement of cards, that I might not have noticed at all, except that the Dowager caught my eye directly afterward and did not look away, which was not the behavior of a woman who had done something casually. She held my gaze for 3 full seconds, with the expression of a general who has opened the first engagement and wishes it noted. At dinner, Richard spoke to Elspeth with the same polite distance he employed with everyone. She answered him without attempting to charm, which I found interesting. Most women placed beside Richard Caldenmere made some effort. He was not yet 40, and he was the Duke, and there were always reasons. Elspeth Vane made no effort at all. She answered his questions directly, asked two of her own that were not flattering questions but practical ones. About the drainage he had mentioned to me, because she had heard him speak of it, and it had a bearing on the kitchen garden, and then let the conversation lapse when it wished to lapse. She did not fill silences in the way that made him retreat. She simply existed beside him, warm and quiet, eating her supper. She talked to him, I realized, as she talked to the ants when they wanted sense rather than sentiment, as a person who deserved a real answer. There was nothing in her manner that said she knew who he was or what he was worth. She had asked about the drainage because she wanted to know about the drainage. Afterward, in the drawing room, I observed that Richard remained standing near the fireplace for longer than usual instead of retreating to the library. I could not prove this had anything to do with the fact that Elspeth sat nearby doing correspondence for the Dowager, but I noted it. He was a man who retreated to the library by 9 o'clock without fail. That evening it was past 10 when he went. On the third day, Aunt Cecily lost a shawl. She lost it specifically in the walled garden on the east side of the house, where she had taken a morning walk, and where, by remarkable coincidence, Richard had gone to look at the old stone wall that needed pointing. The shawl was left on a bench. Mrs. Vane, who had been asked to retrieve it, went to the garden. Richard was there. I watched from an upstairs window, because by this point I had begun to find the whole operation vastly entertaining, and what I witnessed was a 10-minute conversation about the wall, the garden's winter state, and I am fairly certain from the gestures, the kitchen garden drainage that had come up at dinner. When Elspeth came in with the shawl, Aunt Cecily said, with tremendous composure, that she did not know how it had come to be left there. "I expect you walked there this morning," Elspeth said, perfectly pleasantly, and went to return it to her room. I found Aunt Cecily at tea that afternoon and mentioned, in the most innocent tone I could manage, that the walled garden was looking well in November. She said, "Yes, Aubrey dear, isn't it?" in the exact tone of a woman who has placed a piece where she wanted it and is wholly content with the result. So too Aunts the grandmother, I wondered about Miss Harriet. I did not have to wonder long. On the 5th day, it rained, a long, steady November rain that pushed everyone indoors and created the specific kind of country house afternoon that requires occupation or it turns to quarrel. Harriet organized a reading. She assigned the texts with what appeared to be randomness but was not, chose authors and passages with the discrimination of a woman who had considered the matter in advance, and she placed herself, the Dowager, and both aunts at the far end of the room in deep armchairs from which it would have been discourteous to move, and she gave Richard and Elspeth the 2 chairs nearest the window where the light was best, because someone had to do the reading aloud, and Elspeth read aloud beautifully, as anyone who had spent 5 minutes in the house might have noticed. Richard did not read beautifully. He read with the careful precision of a man who reads privately and has not done it aloud since school, and there was something genuinely endearing in his lack of performance, the way he slowed over certain lines without meaning to. But Elspeth was patient when they exchanged passages, and she did not rush, and she laughed once, very quietly, not unkindly, when he mispronounced a French name with perfect confidence, and then corrected it so naturally that it barely registered as a correction at all. At the end of the first hour, I watched Richard read a paragraph twice, once when it was his to read, and once quietly to himself afterward, as if he wanted to keep it. He looked up when he realized she was watching him do it, and she smiled at the page rather than at him, which was exactly the right thing. He went back to reading. I thought, there it is. He did not know what it was yet. He would not have named it. But something in him was paying attention in a way it had not paid attention to anything in 6 years, and all 4 women at the far end of the room were tracking it with the focused stillness of naturalists observing something they had been waiting a long time to see. Harriet, who watched horses and knew the value of stillness, barely moved. That evening I cornered the Dowager. "You are all of you running an operation," I told her, because there was no point in being indirect with a woman who had been watching the field for 81 years. She considered me over her tea. "I don't know what you mean, Aubrey." "The dinner seating, the shawl, today's reading arrangement." "Shawls are mislaid," she said without missing a beat. "And Elspeth does read beautifully. I wasn't going to waste a rainy afternoon on bad reading." "And the dinner seating." "A hostess seats her guests," she said. That is what a hostess does. I have been seating guests for 60 years, and I will not apologize for it. She was not going to admit it, which meant she had no intention of stopping. I asked instead the question that had been forming since the walled garden. Does Mrs. Vane know? The Dowager's expression shifted, a very small shift, but enough. The composure did not break, but something behind it recalculated. She does not, she said, and she won't, she'd only object. I sat with this information. Elspeth Vane had been placed at dinners, nudged into gardens, situated in reading chairs, and she had no idea. She moved through it all in her usual composed way, managing the household and the Dowager's correspondence and the aunt's small crises, and never saw herself as a participant in anything other than the household's general order. She was, I thought, the last person in Caldenmere Hall who would believe she was the object of a plan. "You like her?" I said to the Dowager. It wasn't a question. "She is the first person in this house," the Dowager said, choosing each word with care, "who has not tried to manage me. She simply listens and does what is needed. There is no performance in her. She is not playing a role." She set down her teacup. "Richard has been managed since Alina died. Well-meant management from good people. He has been presented with women who knew they were being presented. He can see that kind of thing from the door, and it closes him like a shutter." She looked at me with something that was almost asking. "Elspeth doesn't know she's there as anything other than what she is. That's why she's the one." I thought about this for the rest of the evening. I thought about it while Richard sat in the library failing to read, which he had been doing with increasing frequency since the afternoon's reading, and I noticed that he had taken from the shelf a volume of the same author whose work Elspeth had read aloud. He was not reading it. He was thinking, in the way he thought when something had lodged in him that he had not yet named. The second week at Caldenmere opened with fog, and a succession of small arrangements that I now recognized with the familiarity of a man watching a campaign he has begun to admire despite himself. Aunt Dorothea had a headache one morning and could not accompany the Dowager on her slow circuit of the lower garden, which meant that Elspeth accompanied her instead, and Richard, who had formed the habit of a morning walk without any apparent design, though I was no longer willing to call anything at Caldenmere undesigned, fell into step with them at the garden gate as naturally as if he had been invited. I watched from the upper window. The Dowager set a pace that ensured the walk took twice as long as it needed to. She stopped to remark on every feature of the garden as if she were cataloging it for posterity: the state of the autumn beds, the pruning of the climbing roses, the replacement of a fence post that had finally surrendered. Richard and Elspeth walked a half-step behind her, and I could not hear what they spoke of, but I could see that they were speaking, not in the careful social back-and-forth of dinner conversation, but in the easier rhythm of people who have found a subject that interests both of them and are following it without watching the clock. At one point, Elspeth said something that made Richard stop walking entirely for a moment before he replied. What she said I could not know, but whatever it was, his reply took some time, and when he finished, she looked at him with an expression I had not seen her use with anyone in the house. Not the warm, efficient look she gave the aunts, not the patient, respectful look she gave the Dowager. Something quieter and more particular. She had, I thought, surprised him into being honest about something, and he had surprised himself by accepting it. The Dowager, walking ahead on Elspeth's arm, did not look back once. She walked on at her measured pace, observing the beds and the wall and the bare espaliered fruit trees, and if her free hand gripped her stick a fraction more firmly than the ground required, it was the only sign that she was aware of what was happening 2 steps behind her. That afternoon I mentioned to Harriet, casually, in passing, that Richard seemed in better spirits than I had seen in some years. Harriet said, "Good air," with an expression that could have meant absolutely anything, and went back to her correspondence. She had a letter to post. She asked Elspeth to see that it went with the afternoon writer. I noticed, because I was paying attention now, that the letter was already sealed and in Harriet's hand, and she had simply given it to Elspeth rather than the footman standing 6 feet away. The footman noticed too. He blinked and said nothing, which was the wisest possible response. By the end of the second week, I had catalogued the following arrangements: 4 dinners at which Elspeth was seated beside Richard or directly across from him; 3 walks in which 2 or more of the ladies had urgent engagements that prevented them from accompanying the Dowager; 1 afternoon at which Aunt Cecily's embroidery wool had been discovered in the conservatory when it had last been seen in the drawing-room, requiring a search that brought Elspeth through the room where Richard was attempting his correspondence. One evening at which the library fire had been lit particularly well, and a chair placed near it that no one in particular had claimed, and Elspeth and Richard had each come to the library for separate reasons and remained for an hour and a half. And one incident involving a horse, which was Harriet's contribution and her most inspired. She had suggested an outing to see the new colt that had been foaled in September, knowing, because she managed the stables with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, that the foaling barn required traversing a muddy stretch of yard, and that Elspeth, whose practical competence extended to horses in general, would be entirely unsentimental about the mud and would simply cross it. She would help the Dowager across it, because she always helped where help was needed, and Richard, who had grown up with horses and genuinely loved them, would find himself in a small, warm barn with a woman who was not frightened of them and did not manufacture delight for his benefit. It worked. I saw them both lean over the low gate to look at the colt, and Elspeth said something that made Richard laugh, not the polite social sound he produced at dinners, which had always been slightly too composed to be genuine, but a real one, sudden and ungoverned, the kind he used to produce before a leaner died. I had not heard that sound in 6 years, and I had to look away because it felt too private a thing to witness. That evening I said to him, at whist, that Mrs. Vane was a remarkable woman. He arranged his cards carefully before answering. He was the kind of man who needed a moment before honesty. Yes, he said, she is. Nothing more, but he meant it in the full sense, not as a pleasantry, not as agreement with my observation. He had been thinking about it. I could tell by the care with which he said it, the way a man speaks about something he has been turning over in his mind for longer than a simple observation would require, settling it into words for the first time. He played his hand. I played mine. We did not speak about it again that evening, but it stayed in the room with us, quiet and present, the way important things do when they have finally been said aloud. 3 days later, the library fire was lit particularly well, Harriet's work, I suspected, because the grate had not burned that generously all visit, and a chair had been placed beside it at an angle that caught the warmth and the lamplight both. No one in particular had claimed it. I heard from the corridor that Elspeth came in to return a volume she had borrowed, and Richard came in to write a letter he had been putting off for a week, and that neither of them left when they might have. I did not listen at the door. But when I passed an hour later, the light was still on beneath it, and the fire was still burning, and the corridor was quiet enough that I could hear, very faintly, the sound of someone reading aloud again, his voice this time, slower than hers, and with more feeling in it than he had put into the reading on the rainy afternoon. I walked on and went to bed with the comfortable sense of a man in a story that is going well. On the 12th day, the campaign collapsed. It was, appropriately, Aunt Cecily who undid it. She was 73 and had very little patience for subtlety that outlived its usefulness, and at luncheon she remarked to no one in particular. The table included Richard, myself, the Dowager, Harriet, Aunt Dorothea, and Elspeth, that it was a shame that the visit was ending when Richard was looking so much more like himself. "Country air," said Harriet immediately, directing a pointed look at her aunt. "Yes, and good company," said Aunt Cecily, with the unstoppable conviction of a woman who has decided the time for subtlety is entirely past. "We chose the company very carefully this season." The table went quiet. Richard looked up from his plate. "I beg your pardon." "The company," Cecily said with perfect equanimity. "We thought about it, the 4 of us, in August." Dorothea wrote it down. "I made a list," Aunt Dorothea agreed. There was a pause of the kind that can only be produced by a remark that requires everyone at the table to recalibrate their understanding of the past 12 days. "Cecily," the Dowager said, with the quietness of full command. "He's 4 days from leaving," Cecily said, unimpressed by command. "He'll go back to Caldenmere Lodge and the autumn sessions, and we won't see him until Christmas, and nothing will have been said, and we'll be back where we started, and I am 80 years old at Michaelmas, and I would like to see the thing done before I am." She looked at Richard with the frank, uncomplicated affection of a woman who has known him since he was in leading strings and sees no reason to manage her feelings about it. "We decided that you needed someone, not a suitable match, not a presented candidate, someone real." She gestured without apparent self-consciousness toward Elspeth. Elspeth had gone very still. She was not a woman who colored easily, but there was something in her face, not embarrassment, exactly. Something closer to the look of a person who has been standing in a familiar room for some time and has just realized there was a mirror on the wall the whole while, and that she has been visible in it without knowing. "Aunt Cecily," said Richard, in the careful voice he used when he was managing a great deal of feeling very quietly. "Oh, don't be forbidding," she said. "You're grateful, really, you just haven't got there yet." Richard looked at the table. Then he looked at the Dowager, who did not flinch but met his gaze with the composed dignity of a woman who has made harder choices than this one and is prepared to defend them all. Then he looked at Harriet, who said nothing but tilted her chin in the way that meant she had considered all possible outcomes and was comfortable with any of them. Then he looked at Aunt Dorothea, who said, "The shawl was deliberate," as though this were helpful clarifying information. "I know," he said very quietly. "I know about the shawl." A pause. "The wool in the conservatory was also deliberate," Dorothea added. "I suspected." "The fire in the library," Cecily offered. "I had begun to wonder about that," he said. "Yes." Elspeth set down her fork. She said, "I did not know." She was looking at no one in particular. Her voice was composed, but the composure had the specific quality of a person assembling it on short notice, brick by careful brick. "I did not know that any of it was, I simply thought." She stopped. "I must apologize. Whatever this was, I was made a part of it without my knowledge, and that is not. I should not have been placed in that position without." "No," Richard said. She stopped. He said it again more quietly. "No." And then, after a moment, "Don't apologize for it. It was not done to you unkindly." "It was not done to me unkindly." He looked at the four women arranged around the table, the four who had arranged the seating and lost the shawl and organized the reading, and displaced the wool and lit the library fire, and walked very slowly past the foaling barn and thought, between them since August, that he needed someone. He found that he had not one single word with which to be angry at them. They had known him for 38 years, most of them. They had watched him close like a house after a leaner died. They had wanted something for him, and they had done the only thing they knew how to do, which was arrange. He said to them very quietly, "Thank you." The Dowager's eyes, which had been careful and watchful throughout, softened in a way I had not seen them soften in a long time. Cecily looked satisfied in the manner of a woman who was right and knew it, and was not going to make a performance of that fact. Harriet looked at the table. Dorothea nodded gently, the way she did when things had arrived where she believed they were meant to be. Luncheon ended shortly afterward, with an air of something accomplished and deliberately not discussed further. The four ladies scattered to their various corners of the house with the orderly efficiency of people who have brought something to a decisive point and trust it to proceed without further assistance. Richard asked me, when we were alone in the corridor, if I would walk with him in the garden. "No," I said, "go and find Mrs. Vane." He looked at me. "She's in the kitchen garden," I told him, because I knew where she went when she needed a moment to think. I had noticed this on the 5th day, when the rain had finally broken in the afternoon, and she had gone out for 20 minutes between the reading and the dinner preparations, and I had seen which gate she used. "She's been managing their schemes and their dinners and their shawls for 12 days, and no one has asked what she wanted. Go and ask her." He went. I watched from the upper window, the same window I had used 11 days before, watching the shawl operation with the entertained distance of a man who had thought himself a spectator. I could see the kitchen garden below, the lay-tautum beds turned and quiet, and Elspeth standing at the gate that led to the orchard, not going in, just standing with her hands in the pockets of her coat, and her face turned up toward the pale November sky. Richard came through the gate from the house side. She heard him and turned. I could not hear them. I could see that he spoke for some time, standing still, not moving toward her, but not at any remove either, the way a man speaks when he is choosing words he has been turning over in his mind for some days and wants to get right. That she listened without looking away. That at some point she said something briefly, and he paused and then answered at greater length, with a care that was very like the way he had said yes. She is, the evening before at whist, the care of a man who means every word and wants none of them wasted. That she looked at the garden for a moment afterwards, thinking, and then looked back at him. And that she said something that made him, I will swear to this from the window, across the kitchen garden, with the pale November light between us, exhale as if he had been holding his breath for 6 years, and had only just remembered that he was allowed to stop. I went and sat in the library. I did not need to watch any more. When they came in for tea, there was nothing dramatic, no alteration that would have been legible to anyone who had not been paying very close attention. They did not sit together. Elspeth poured, as she always did, and the Dowager asked Richard about the first quarter's returns with the apparent complete indifference of a woman who had not spent a fortnight engineering his domestic happiness, and Harriet talked about the colt and what he might look like in the spring. But Richard passed Elspeth the sugar bowl when she reached for it, a half-second before she reached, because he had been watching, and she said, "Thank you," in her usual composed way, and something in the ordinary sound of it was entirely different from 11 days ago, in a way I cannot fully explain and do not intend to try. He stayed another week. The 4 ladies of Caldenmere received this information at dinner that evening with a unanimity of quiet satisfaction that was, I thought, the most disciplined celebration I had ever witnessed. Cecily said, "Good, the firewood is already ordered." Harriet said, "The colt will be stronger by then." Aunt Dorothea nodded in the serenity of a woman who had found her wool precisely where she meant it to be all along. The Dowager said nothing, and looked at Richard with the expression of a woman who has been right about something very important, and is content to let that be its own sufficient monument. I left at the end of my own fortnight, as planned, because I am a man of moderate wisdom, and moderate wisdom knows when to stop witnessing and let a thing breathe. What I can tell you is this. In 38 years of knowing Richard Caldenmere, I had watched him be presented with every advantage his name and estate could manufacture. The right families, the right assemblies, the right women placed carefully beside him at precisely the right tables. None of it had touched him after a leaner. None of the carefully chosen candidates, none of the tactful marchionesses, none of the 3 women at that winter supper who had each been installed beside him in careful succession. And then 4 women who loved him and knew him and had watched him close himself up for 6 years, decided that what he needed was not a presentation but a person. And they chose the one who had been moving through their house for a year without trying to be noticed, managing their fires and their correspondence and their quarrels about curtains, and they put her in his path as quietly and persistently as water finding the low ground. He was right at luncheon to thank them. What those 4 ladies understood, the Dowager with her 81 years of watching, and Cecily with her impatience and her honesty, and Harriet with her horses and her lists, and Dorothea with her gently wandering wool, was the thing that all the right assemblies had missed, that Richard Caldenmere did not need to be impressed or managed or presented. He needed to be surprised into honesty, and for that you did not need a suitable match. You needed a woman who would talk to him about kitchen drainage, and read aloud without performing it, and stand in a foaling barn without manufacturing delight, and who had no idea she was doing any of it for a reason. Elspeth Vane had been doing it all for a year, for no reason at all. And that, in the end, was why she was the one.